All right, welcome everyone. I am happy that you guys made it for tonight's presentation. We usually do this on Tuesday, but yesterday was Valentine's Day, and I was traveling back from Mexico where I was doing some dental work. I have some issues with some teeth. I had a tooth extracted. I had a failed implant repaired on. And the expense of doing all that here in the U.S. is just ridiculous. They quoted me $25,000 to do all that, and it's going to end up being $5,000. So even though I spent 7 days in a five-star resort, all inclusive by the beach, and all the expenses involved, it was still far cheaper than what I had to do there. So. All right, yeah, Cambodia might be an option if it weren't so expensive, right? The flights and everything. But I heard people have some great care. So if you know of any dentist guys in Cambodia, you may want to post that here, Greg. All right. So a couple of news here before we get started. Number one is we posted an updated relinker. Those of you who were here last month, we Mark Edwards and I made available, mostly because of through Mark's effort, a program that you can incorporate into your Access database that allows you to manage all the linking and through a table on your database, right? So you list all the tables that you want in a database. It reads that table, and then you're able to link that, have the code link through you automatically with no DSN. Just a wonderful piece of technology. We have an updated version of that. So let me get you real quick for you. If you go to our YouTube channel, if this is the first time here, welcome, by the way. Appreciate it. My name is Juan Soto. I'm an Access MVP. I'm also the founder of AccessUserGroups.org. One of the reasons I found this organization is back when I had hair on my head, I would travel a lot to access user groups around the world. And I would notice a couple of things. Number one, attendance at local user groups was going down significantly. And number two, the age of the people coming to this group was getting older and older. And so I said, there's a real need to go online with all this stuff. So I modeled this organization after PASS, online user groups no longer happens. That organization passed through history. Now I think it's a privately owned. But, we've since passed 5,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, so appreciate that. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Let me get you that link and get that for you. Let's see here. Play out videos. Okay. Playlist. Access specific, SQL Server. Actually, we have multiple playlists here. Access SQL Server. Here you go. All right. All right. Let me get you that link. Copy, and I will paste it here. All right. So if you check the comments here, there's a revised link that's a little bit better. And Mark Edwards was on the call here tonight. If you have any questions regarding the relinker, he can answer them for you. Mark, are you there?
Here, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So if you have any questions for Mark, please put it in the comments there. And download that relinker. It's going to save you a lot of effort, a lot of grief managing your tables and Access.
Explanation is it's magic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm sure we'll be happy to hear that.
Where'd you put the link?
It's in the comments. If you look at the comments in the Zoom, you'll see it there. If you also look at if you missed last month's presentation, which was great, I'm gonna put a link to the.
Oh, please do. I meant to be there, but I missed it.
Yeah, we started with some Chat GPT where we created some VBA programs with the artificial intelligence. So that was pretty neat. All right. So for the first time in 3 years, some Access news for you guys. We're going to finally have another MVP summit in Seattle. Microsoft is put out the word that they're going to have the community come together. We used to do that on a yearly basis, and the deal was you showed up, you paid your way to get to Seattle, and then they would put you up in a hotel for free. Wine you and dine you. They really did treat us really great. They would bus us to the Microsoft campus every morning, bus us back. We'd have evening events, cocktail mixers, party. The last night we'd have party, giant party. Sometimes they would rent out an entire stadium, like the Seattle Seahawks Stadium. We had party there, and it was just amazing to come together with all these MVPs around the year. This year, they're not paying for the hotel. They're getting cheap on me. And, you know, I get it. They're leaving off people, and I think it's a bad look. So we have to pay our own way. And I'm on the fence. It coincides with my wife's birthday this year, and I'm on the fence where I'm going or not. But the nice thing is they're going to make it hybrid, so we can go on there. Now, if you're not familiar with the MVP program, there's only 22 Microsoft Access MVP. It's the highest rating you can get in terms of any expertise in the Microsoft Access field. And we have to renew, they renew you every year. In fact, my renewal is coming up now in March. One of the benefits is the MVP Summit, plus they give you free copies of software. And it's somebody says here, Donna to me. I can't see the comments. Donna to me. Let me see if I can. If wherever you type in there, let me go ahead and put it in there again for you, Donna. So if you look at the, you probably should, you started here after I put the comments, so you won't see prior comments. So if you click on that link there, George, you're not seeing it either. The comments here. Let me see. Looks like nobody's seeing my comments. All right, everyone in the meeting. Well, I'm texting everybody in the meeting. Let me go and get the link again.
It's in the chat, meeting chat. I can see it.
You can see it. Okay, let me go ahead and put it there. If you were late, you may not see it. So go ahead. I went ahead and put it in there again, guys. Let me see if I can click on this. Make sure it comes up. Oh, no. All right. Hold on a second. There's something wrong with this link. Download now available. That download description, I put the wrong URL in the description of the video. Give me a second here. I'll get it for you real quick. So yeah, I'm excited about that. We usually we come together in the summit and we discuss high-end topics with the Microsoft Access team that's responsible for improving the product. That's another advantage of being Access MVP. You are basically you're basically in touch with the Access team in Seattle. So if I get stuck, I never abuse it, but I probably reached out to them once or twice during my career. But if you get stuck, you know, they're more than happy to help you out, and just a wonderful ability to be able to, it's wonderful just to be able to have access to the team. All right, so copy a link to URL to keyboard. Let me see if now this works. All right, there you go. There's the full link there. Let me just test it. Yep, it download a file. Zip file. It's not viral. It's fine. Don't be alarmed if you get a error message there viral. I need to update the description of that video later on. It's in the comments there. Let me see if there's other people pending to come in. No, everybody's here. All right, great. So that's another one bit of news. The other bit of news, there have been some updates on the Access roadmap. I encourage you to take a look at that. And we passed 5,000 subscribers. So if you haven't yet, please do me a favor. And if you love this organization like I do, please go ahead and like our channel on YouTube. George, I just pasted the link there in the comments. Does anybody see that ends with a -2.zip? No? Oh boy. Let me see. What am I doing wrong? It says all participants. Everyone in meeting. Can't see anything. Who can see your messages? Recording on. Recording on so the account owner and everyone in the meeting can see and scan your messages. Only you and those you chat with can save their messages. All right. Let me see. What am I doing wrong here? The one George put in here for YouTube. Well, look, let me see something here. Yeah, press enter. Me to everyone. So let me just share my. This is me to. Okay, Greg says he got it. Thanks, Greg.
I just saw it come through.
Oh, you got it now. Don's just got it now. All right, thank you. It looks like it's coming through. It looks like there was a delay. All right. And that's on that YouTube video last month. So this month topic, we are talking about views. And views are simply, another name for queries, right? So in Microsoft Access, when we create a query, we call it a query, but when you create a query in SQL Server and save that query, it's called a view. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and talk about how to create views. And this, we might split this up into 2 months because I'm taking painkillers and they're wearing off a little bit. So we'll see how long I can last here. But let me go ahead and share my screen. Splash business. All right, share.
That's external.
I'm sorry, somebody is in the background talking and two people are talking at the same time. What was that? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. So in SQL Server, they're called views when you save the query. Now, I'm not going to bore you with I'm not going to PowerPoint you to death. So listen up. The single most important thing you can do to improve performance between Microsoft Access and SQL Server is to leverage views. Why is that? Number one, you're leveraging what I call the muscle of the server, right? So the server has vast more resources than Microsoft Access could. SQL Server runs circle around Access, even the free version, SQL Server Express. And so you want to be able to leverage that server resources through views. And you store the views here. Now, if you go into your database in SQL Server, you would bring up the database. I have this database RCBE, and I clicked on views, and we have lots of views in this application that we use to demo our to new customers. And a view is much more easier to leverage that SQL Server because all the computation is going at the server level. All right. So if you have, for example, a complex query that has multiple tables with many relationships, Access will be able to process that query with SQL Server, and the ODBC driver translates that Access query to a SQL Server query, and SQL Server then receives that translation and executes the query. Now, we last year, I remember I had a person on who did some extensive analysis of how SQL Server processes an Access query. And what SQL Server does, it breaks down the query into multiple queries. So if you have a complex query with multiple tables, multiple joins, it's going to split that in different queries and do that. So that's a fascinating conversation, which I can't remember. George, do you remember who it was that came on? He wrote a blog post. I invited him on, and he talked extensively about this. But if you remember who it was, let me know. But
if I remember, yeah. How
yeah,
long ago was it?
it was last year. Sometime last year we had him on. It could have been even the year before that. But he had a great analysis where he did SQL trace and trace how SQL Server processes access queries. However, one of the advantage over Access processing at the query, right? Because I have an Access database here. Let me bring up my Access demo here. I have this Access database. All right, and I've got, when I go to my queries, I have multiple queries. So right now I'm in tables and here are queries, right? So I've got these queries. These queries will work. No question about that. Now, some of them might time out eventually because they're too complex. There's too much data involved. These select queries. So what it takes Access maybe several minutes, it will take maybe several seconds for SQL Server to process, right? On the high end when you have complex queries. Now, when you take a query here in Access, I'm just going to pick any query here. You have what we call Access SQL, right? Which is go in here and right click on this. By the way, this view that you see here, the name I have for this view is Query by Design, right? Where I can add fields by double clicking on the field to the query and put in criteria. This is called QBE, Query by Design. But if I right click and I select SQL View, I can then right click and copy this, right? And take it to SQL Server. And then I'm going to create a new query, right? Like we have the new query button here. and then paste it on here. And now I've got this query in SQL Server. Now, this being a select query, notice right away I have some squiggly lines here because it doesn't like these special characters, right? It's just a mess. But if I save this as a view, or I create a view from scratch, which I'm going to show you next, there's some inherent advantages. Number one is the fact that when everything in SQL Server has a plan, a processing plan, right? And if I bring up one of these views here, let me bring up these views in design view. And I press Control L. Actually, I need to copy this SQL here and then press Control L. Let me copy this. Bring up a new query, paste it there. And then press Control L. All right, I see the execution plan. This execution plan is what SQL Server came up with. Every time it executes this query, it's going to go through this plan, right? It's going to select this table, then it's going to compute a scalar, cost, and so forth. And you can bring up this view by pressing Control in SQL Server. When you save this as a view, the query and the plan get saved in SQL Server. And I mentioned this throughout the Academy prior sessions. But when you save this view, and the next time you run this view, it's going to be faster because it doesn't have to create the execution plan. It just already has it in place, and it's stored on the SQL Server. Now, you could modify these execution plans, and for all the years I've been doing this, I've never had a need to modify the execution plan, but there are SQL Server professionals who will look at this and they say, well, that's not right. Let me go and modify it, right? That's a little higher, a little above my pay grade. But, you know, when you save these views, SQL Server is smart enough to know when they're used. So let's say, for example, you have a view that's used on startup. Well, every time you start the application, it's going to execute that view. And if you got 20 employees, you come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they're starting this application between 8 and 8:05, that's 20 sessions that's going to be executed in the server. And the server is going to see all the demand of that view ramp up. And it's going to say, wait a second, this view is being used so many times. Let me keep it in memory so the next user who comes along can then have the results much more faster, right? And so that's why you'll see that as your application is being used by more and more people, that they will, the server will, you even see that little speed boost because now it keeps those objects in memory. Now, most of my clients use SQL Server Express. And what is one of the major drawbacks of SQL Server Express? It only uses 1 gigabyte of RAM, right? So it's a little harder for the application for SQL Server to keep that in memory when they only have 1 gig of RAM. You can have 16 gigs of RAM, but no, Microsoft's not dumb. They want you to buy the standard license. And so you want to be able to, it won't be as good as you have the standard license where it can leverage all the memory in the server. So that's one advantage of SQL Server Views. But more than anything else, you can speed up your application with views. The second thing you can do is create stored procedures, which we'll be talking later on this year, how to create and optimize stored procedures for your application as part of the Academy. One of the aspects of being able to be an expert in this field like we are is that I give an objective to my clients. So look, I want to be able to have everything run in 3 seconds or less, right? We're talking about a database in Azure, stored in Azure, right? A cloud-based database with a Microsoft Access front end running the desktop. So 1001, 1002, 1003, a form opens up or report opens up or whatever. As you're interacting with the program, people are willing to wait a little bit, right? They're willing to wait 3 seconds, right? Probably the amount of time a web page might come up, or a really complex web page. Beyond 3 seconds, they'll start tapping their feet. Okay, come on, let's get going here. Now, there is exceptions to that, right? If I have a report to execute that takes me 30 seconds, I'll consult with the client. And the client might say, well, that report, we only run that once a quarter, so I'm willing to wait 30 seconds, right? Instead of spending 2 or 3 hours on that. We're not cheap. My hourly rate is not the cheapest in the world, as you can imagine. So, I always consult with my client before I spend their money. And they might tell me, yeah, we're not worried about that report. But if it's something that's used constantly in the application, you want to be able to leverage views on there. Now, when you create these views and then use the table relinker that Mark Edwards created last month, they will show up as tables, right? So for example, this view balance due, if I come into Access here and I do balance due, balance. Let's see if it shows up here. Not every view, here we go. So this one shows up. It shows up like every normal table. Right, and so if I were to open this view here, it would calculate on the server and bring down the results. And that's another thing about the views. The computations occur at the server level. When you open the view here in Access, it looks like there's a table. To access just another table, a link table. It is open, sends that request to SQL Server. Hey, I'm opening this view, and SQL Server makes a computation, sends the results back to the Access desktop. If you use this view as part of a report, all right, or you use it in another query with criteria, what's going to happen is the Access will send that entire query to SQL Server, right? So if I create a new query based on this view and put in criteria in it, it'll send the whole SQL syntax over to SQL Server. SQL Server processes the whole thing and sends it back. If SQL Server cannot process a query, what happens? Well, the worst case scenario happens. Right, so if I use this view with a local table, that's a big no-no. We call those hybrid queries. I call them hybrid queries. Well, yeah, that's a big no-no because what's going to happen is that you send this query, you say, okay, I'm going to do this query, balance due, and I'm going to join it with a local table called TBL states, which is a list of United States. SQL Server gets the query to the ODBC driver, says, well, I don't know what TBL states here, but here's the contents of BW underscore balance due, you calculate it, right? And all that data comes over the wire, and Access then needs to do the query. That's why sometimes they time out, because it's receiving all that massive amount of data over the wire. So please avoid hybrid queries and leverage these views to make it easier on yourself and on your customers to be able to use your application. All right. So I have some really nice tips here for you guys who've never created views. One of them is we created a tool at AccessUserGroups.org. So I'm gonna here, come in here, and you notice that there's this query here. So I'm gonna right-click copy, right? And I'm going to go to the Access User Group website. And I was playing with this earlier, but I'm going to erase this here. I have over here. But if you go to this website, you notice that it says SQL Converter, right? So if you go to the website, AccessUserGroups.org. So let me go from the beginning. So I'm going to click on AccessUserGroups.org. You go to SQL Converter. And kudos to Ben Shapiro, who not Ben Shapiro, Ben, who helped do this. I must massacre his name there. Sorry, Ben, if you're on the call. He does join us from time to time. But I'm going to paste this here, the Access query here, and then I'm going to click on this Convert button. Now, keep in mind the SQL Server version. So based on the SQL Server version, the SQL syntax may slightly vary, right? So I'm going to leave it as 2012. I'm going to click on Convert. So now that I put the version, I got pasted in there again. All right, click on Convert. This is a tool, by the way, is used so many times throughout the day by people around the world. I'm really proud of the work we did there. So notice how you have now a properly formatted SQL query. It converted anything that was related to Access and converted over to SQL Server. If you notice that the order by says date minus date invoice, over here it's changed it to get date minus date invoice. So it's smart enough to recognize that the Access syntax is date, open parenthesis, close parenthesis. That should be replaced by get date. And this is invaluable because back in the old days, before this tool, you had to know that date function is get date, and you had to go in there and manually populate it. All right. So that's number one. Number two is if you scroll down this page, let me click on allow cookies. There's a copy button here. So when I copy this, it's going to actually copy that into memory. And now when I go into SQL Server, and I'm going to create a new query and then paste it there. It's there right for me. All right. So if I execute this, Invalid then close. Well, there was some additional issues there. It looks like the table invoices is that's an old query that was converted to views. That's why I put this, but now it's already copied there. And I need to address this whole close here. Let me see if I delete the close. It will still run. Let me see. I'm gonna delete that field and execute that. All right, there it goes. Okay. So if I would have pasted the original query from Access, it would cause any errors. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to paste the original query from Access in here. So I'm actually going to put it in here, and I'm going to go back to Access. Actually, I can go back here to the web page and click on copy on this side, and then come back to the SQL Server Management Studio. All right, paste it there. Now, here's the tip. You can actually highlight. Notice all the squiggly lines right off the bat, right? So I'm actually highlight that. And actually, no, this is not, that's it, right? Yeah. I execute, it gives me all kinds of error messages, right? So it didn't work. So it's just a wonderful way to be able to do that. But it gets better. A lot of times you have to run queries in your code, right? So if I come in my code here, and press Control G as in Gabriel, that brings up the IDE, right? Integrated Development Environment for Microsoft Office. I will then be able to, I might have a procedure, right? The button that calculates totals or what have you. And so if I wanted to copy that, query, right? So I go back to the web page and I copy the right syntax. I'm gonna click on copy, come over here to the Microsoft Access. I can literally devote probably all night to just this tool, but all right. So I'm gonna create a new sub here. Public sub 1 test. And I'm gonna say dim str SQL string. You probably know this. What's gonna happen next. Now I'm gonna have to paste my SQL code, right? I'm gonna say str SQL equal, and then paste the query I got from the right. And now I gotta fix this because this is not gonna compile, right? If I come over here and click over here, it's not. I just know it's not gonna compile. So now I gotta come in here, put double quote in here. Go to the end of this line, put a space, double quote, ampersand, underscore, right? And go through every line. And this is just a few lines. I've had queries that span dozens of lines. And in the old days, back when I had hair in my head, it would take me a few minutes, right? 5-6 minutes to properly format. Then if I make a mistake and compile, it doesn't compile, or execution time doesn't work. I mean, this just goes on and on and on. Instead of that, you're going to love this feature. See, right now it says invalid expression. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete all that. Instead of doing all of that, you can actually rebuild that into the tool on the web. So let me show you how that works. So I'm going to go back to the website, AccessUserGroups.org. And look at this little tab here. It says VBA. See that VBA? I click on VBA. And of course it doesn't work. So let me refresh it. All right, let me go ahead and copy this just to be sure. Let me refresh the page. And paste that here again. So to convert.
Juan, I noticed it was doing that all day today, but if you just rerun it, it does it again. It's just something happening today on that.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for the tip. All right. So now here it uses the variable str SQL. So if you use that in your code, you won't be a problem. I'm going to click on copy. Oh, so I'm sorry. Who was that who just spoke?
Donna.
Hi, Donna. Well, great to hear that you're using it. Does this save you a lot of time?
Yeah. I live in that. Like I'm converting a huge project right now, and I have very complicated queries and subqueries, and yeah, it's a godsend.
So you're really okay. Good to hear. I'm glad to hear it worked. I mean, it took us many moons to design the tool, so it's great to hear these kind of stories. So as you can see, it's properly formatted now. I don't have to worry about, it even puts the SQL in front of it. Now, something you may not realize when you come over here is it'll do the same thing for the Access side, because sometimes you have an Access query. You don't want to convert to SQL Server, but then you can do the VBA over here. It'll do the same thing for you over there. And now I got to refresh it. How do I refresh it down again so I get it? Do I hit the convert
Oh, well,
button?
I just press convert again and it seems to work.
Okay. All right, let me do that. All right. Same thing here now. So I got the best of both worlds, right? So I've got a query and Access. And as a professional developer, you're going to see this over and over again, that you have to put queries in your code. And just having this tool. Now, there are some companies that will sell you this. I believe Luke Chong has, from FMS, has utility that does this for you. And his is probably more powerful, more convenient because it's right into the Access application tool. So you may want to consider Luke and look at his tool that does that. But the fact is that you want to be able to you can do that, or you can use this application. All right, so now you created this query, you got it right in SQL Server. Now, by the way, and not every query requires going through that conversion process. So if you have a simple select query that you want to create a view for, just paste it here in SQL Server Management Studio first, create the view, which I'm going to show you how to do that next, and then it'll work. Right, so you can just try this and then see. Now, you always want to verify, right? Two things. Here's something I always tell my students: trust but verify, right? And you need to know the answer before you ask the question. What do I mean by that? If you have a query in Access, a select query in Access that generates 1,000 rows, right? And if you had a column called order total and you added up that order total column, it adds up to $1.2 million. And you have that same query in SQL Server you create a view for, make sure you run it and at least do a comparison in terms of the number of rows, because if you have 1,000 rows in Access, you need to come up with 1,000 rows in SQL Server. And if all the totals and the order totals add up to 1.2 million, it needs to add up in SQL Server, right? So if I click on execute here and I click on this little button here and I copy all my data, right? I can copy all my data. Right click, copy, go to Excel, add up that balance column. It needs to add up, right? The paid column here, that needs to add it up to what I have in Access, because remember, management's hired you for your expertise. And the last thing you want is for people, your users, to question your work and to question the program. And so when you get caught by people, when you don't bother verifying your queries, when you bother checking the totals, and you just blindly go through the steps of creating these views, you're going to get caught eventually. One day, you're going to get caught by an auditor or whoever that is, and it's going to be a lot of egg in your face. So you want to make sure that you trust but verify and make sure you know the answer before you ask the question. A lot of times, you don't have that capability to run it both in Access and SQL Server and compare, right? Sometimes it's a brand new query that you have in SQL Server. So how are you going to compare it to Access? You probably ask me. Well, there are several things. Number one, you may want to limit the criteria of the query to something reasonable, export the result to Excel, compute it there, and create a similar analysis in Excel from Access data, right? To be able to see it, to compare and use your judgment and make sure that whatever query you do come up with is correct, because that's the problem with queries. It's not exact science. I can create this query, you can create this query, both come up with the same results, and not necessarily the same looking query, right? So, all right, that's my little nagging feature there. All right, so there's several ways to create your query right now. I already have this query here. I got it from the tool. I can say use a create, right? Create view. I'm sorry, there's several ways to create a view. Create view, VW underscore one test. Now, why do we use VW underscore as? We use VW underscore to indicate the objects in the view. So all my objects, all my view objects start with VW. All my tables start with TBL. It's just a bad habit I have. There's pros and cons to doing that. But the nice thing about that is when I link it to Access, I know that it's a view because it starts with VW, right? That's an advantage. Now, you've seen me do this before tonight, but I'm going to do this again. I can select just a portion of this, just run it. It actually runs the query. Or I cannot select anything and run it. When I execute this, what's going to happen is going to create that object PW score. It doesn't like the order by. That's my next point. When you create views, the order by clause is invalid, right? It doesn't want the order by clause. So there's several things you can do here. You can delete it from here, or you can comment it out. So I'm gonna delete here, and now I'm gonna go run the execute here again. Now I've created my object. If I were to again hit the execute button again, it's gonna give me an error message. When you mean create view, it's already created, right? So it'll give me an error message. So if you see this, you didn't realize that. If I want to alter this view, right, I make a change, I can do the alter command. So I do alter, and then I made my change and I execute this, and now this will run without a problem. So every time I want to modify the view, I click on alter. All right. I create this view, but you'll notice that it won't show up on the left-hand side here. So you need to refresh this view list. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the top here on views and click on refresh. And once I do that, my WAN test will show up. When you have a lot of objects in SQL Server Managed Studio, a lot of you, Donna was mentioning how she has you can actually filter this list by clicking on the filter icon up here and then going to contains, right? And then you can say, okay, WAN. And then I can click on okay. It'll actually filter the list and show me my view, right? So it's a pretty convenient way of quickly locating stuff, right? So by creating this view, again, I've saved the execution plan with this view. And if I want to see the execution plan, what is the combination? Control what? Larry, right? Control Larry, L. So Control L. And there's my execution plan, which is a lot more complex than the prior one. Now that I saved the view, I can link it to my front end. There's several ways I can do that. I can use a DSN, which has its problems, right? You want to do DSN because then you have to create DSN every workstation using the application. You can use DSN list technique that's created in that linker that you had access to. I posted in the comments, right? Either one, or you can use it in a pass-through query, right? And you can modify the ODBC parameters of the pass-through query and paste that and use that view there in the pass-through query. Point here is now you're on your way to really turbocharging the application so that your customer is really happy with the results. So this is one way of doing it. Now notice that this view uses how many tables? Well, it uses another view, right? So this view is based on another view paid. But there's another way to create a view, which is what I can use is this to create a new view. I can come in here, create a new view, right? And ask me, okay, what table? So let's go ahead and pick the TBL companies. And this is more what I would do when I first started with SQL Server. Believe it or not, I would do this more often than not because I didn't know anything about SQL Server. I didn't know anything about views. I just know I just needed them. All right, so I'm going to do TBL companies. And let me go ahead and click on company docs. Oh, I put companies there twice. That's fine. Company docs, company types. All right. So if you're used to creating queries and Access this way, there's no shame in doing it this way, right? In SQL Server. I do that too. I'm gonna delete this one as extra. Notice that it's just like Access does. It automatically assumes the relationships, right? So when you have this a foreign key, company ID, these other tables automatically create these. And just like in Access, you can modify these by right-clicking here on this, and you can say, okay, I want a select all rows from companies, right? So I click the right join, or I can create a left join. So if you notice here, when I do that, I create a left auto join here when I right-clicked on that. When I do the other way around, for a company type, I want everything we're doing company type, right? Full auto join. It says full auto join up here. And then when I put it back the way it is originally is all right. Boy, how did I get this back? Now, this is why I start playing with this. I can't go into problems here. But let's see, properties. No, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to say inner join. I'm going to modify my SQL code on the bottom. This is, I wish Access did this, by the way. Any modifications I do down here, it'll do. So I'm going to say inner join here. Right, I say inner, I click up here. Of course, I did that wrong. Inner join. There it is. Okay, good. All right, so any changes here, right? Now I'm ready to pick my fields, right? So I'm gonna say, okay, let me company ID here, document type ID. So I'm gonna click on the little box here next to it, document type ID, company ID, and I'm gonna take company type from over here, right? I'm just randomly picking fields. So notice that, and this is another way I learned TSQL, right? So this is called TSQL, transaction SQL. T stands for transaction. All right, and this is how I learned the TSQL, because I would make my changes up here and I would see how it would do it, right? So one great way is, well, what if I did a different alias, right? So instead of the document type ID, right, I put in doc. Well, I'm just randomly doing these things so you can see a couple points I'm trying to make. So notice that when I did that, it says if I'm automatically put in as doc type, and as if I modify it down here, it'll automatically modify it up there. So doc type 2, for example, if I put the letter number 2, and I come up here, it automatically does it up here. Right. So it's just a great way of doing 3 things at once. You can make changes up here, you can make changes in the grid, or you can make changes in the TSQL, and it gets reflected in either way, which is a wonderful tool that does here. I wish Access did this, right? It was just to be just much more easier on us. So now that you've created this view, now I'm going to click on the save button, right? And I'm going to save this. I'm going to press Control S to save, and it's going to ask me for a view. And again, I'm going to do a vScoper. You do one test 2, because I already have a 1 test, right? And now I've saved that view here. There will come with several drawbacks to this. Number 1, you can't see the execution plan from here. At least I'm not aware of a way to do this. Sometimes I say things and somebody in the audience says, well, actually you can. But again, I'm not an expert in SQL Server. I told you at the beginning when we started this academy way back earlier last year. But I am an expert in interaction with Access and SQL Server. Greg says, I use Create View even for viewing a SQL Server query so I could see it visually, even if I don't save it as a view. Oh, that's a good point. All right, so right, great. So now you have an inkling, right, of how this interface works. Again, you don't have to use it to create your view, but it is great for people who are starting up like yourselves. A lot of people in the audience are starting up, and this is a great way to get familiarized on how to create views and even SQL syntax. Now, it so happens you have the same capability in the irregular view. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to start a regular query, excuse me. So I'm going to right click copy. And I'm going to go ahead and start a new query. I'm going to paste it there. And I'm going to highlight this. And then we'll right click, pay attention, right click, and we'll select Design Query in Editor. And again, I'm back to the same thing. So you don't have to create the query view, to get this interface, right? You can come in here and make changes. So for example, I want it's created by here, click on OK, and it'll modify this right here. So you can do that. So that's another way of using that query by example technology to be able to do that if you're so inclined. Over the years, as you get better at this, you will find some other ways to do it much more easier. But I still, to this day, sometimes will use that query by example window to create my queries. And SQL Server, right?
Juan,
all right. Yes.
Could I ask a quick question? I might be jumping ahead, but in terms of when you create a view in SQL Server and you've created that view, like your view 1 test, and then you want to filter your view 1 test for a particular project number. So, and because you can't sort a view, is one of your standard practices what you do in Access? Do you create a query in Access that calls that view and filters it? Or do you always, especially if you want it as an editable view for a form?
Yeah, especially that. Yeah, you do your sorting, you filter on the front end. That's where you do that. That's great point.
Does it like, so if that 1 test view, maybe returned 1,000 records and you wanted to filter it, and when you filtered it by invoice number, that's going to give you 10 records. Would all 1,000 records from the 1 test view come down to Access and then get filtered by Access when you do the query that way, or how does that work?
No, the server was supposed to do that, right? Again, I preface by saying, if you stick to syntax that SQL Server understands,
Okay.
do that work for you, right? Now, for example, I could create a query in Access, use that view as my basis, and then in the criteria field, call a local access function called, filter out invoices, parentheses, open parentheses, closing parentheses, right? Because you can use functions as criteria. When that goes to SQL Server is like, I don't know what this function is. It sends you all those 1,000 field records down to Access, and now with Access, we'll have to do it, right? So I preface by saying, yeah, SQL Server will only send you 10 records if it understands what you're doing.
So that's true whether you're using a pass-through query or not. Like
Well, if you're using
I'm
pass-through query, by definition, you can't call a function right outside.
Right,
So pass-through
right.
query, you're good.
So if
as
I
you get
just
to work.
if I just said select star from view one test where invoice number equals 1, 2, 3, 4, and I did that in an Access query, that should filter it to invoice 1, 2, 3, 4 before it sends it back. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Absolutely. Now I use a technique when I bind my views to forms. I use the technique, right? And keep in mind that we're at Tampa, we're design solutions that can be used by 100 employees, right? I mean, over 100 people want to use a web app, but as they're still with me over the years, we started with 10 employees. I have a client in Colorado that I still remember this. When I first went out there, they were above a liquor store in Colorado, right? So I flew in, I met with the team. It was like 5 or 6 of them. I met with the 2 owners. And God bless her, she had started the application Access, and I went there and I won their business over to migrate to SQL Server in the cloud. Well, now there are 100 plus employees, and they're still using the Access front end, and it's grown into a multi-million-dollar business. And they at one point they were growing 100% a year. And so when you have large data sets, a large amount of data, they deal a lot of millions of rows of records, right? You want to bind your views to the form. So on startup, it does the query, right? All right. So in other words, I might use the open argument of the form to say, here's the open the invoice form and only show me invoice 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. And so I'll pass that open argument. The form itself is not bound to any data source when I save it. When it opens up the opening event of the form, I say in the opening event of the form, go ahead and retrieve this data. Me.open record source equal, right? Select star from VW_1 test where invoice number is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. And it retrieves only that record. All right. And if they want to see another record, tough. They have to close the form, go back to the search form, what have you, and open that other record, right? So I limit them to only viewing one record at a time because of the fact that I want to avoid traffic and I want it to be optimal, and I want the server to be available to other people. Because if I'm hogging that server, every time I'm using this form, it brings down 1,000 records. And you got 100 employees. That's far too much data going back and forth that needed. So as your application grows, which sounds like you have a fairly complex application, Donna.
Yeah, it very much is, and it's very, very custom. It does a lot of nifty stuff. But I was doing that too. But I also use it uses temp tables. For example, it's a very complicated purchase order process. So when they come in, they see a list of all their purchase orders. And I do that now through a pass-through query because it's read-only. They select a purchase order from the list. And then it actually on open event, it passes the open args, just like you were saying. And I set the record. So I populate the temp tables with that. And then they can add master detail records and everything. And then when they click the save button, it actually does the post, and the time to copy it from the temp table to the live SQL table is instantaneous. It doesn't matter. And then all of the other post-processing I do in stored procedures because now that record's been saved. And those were the big things I had to convert because I was doing it joining to my local temp table because A, it was faster, and B, it had only the record I was dealing with. Now I had to actually just kind of move all of that functionality into stored procedures, but it's blazingly fast. Like it really is.
Nice. That's great to hear. That's good to hear. I tend to avoid doing that, right? Because It works great, but like you said, it looks amazingly fast. But the drawback is now there's a lot more code involved in the back end, behind the scenes. A lot more code that could potentially cause problems every time it's changed, right? And so I try to avoid that methodology and just stick to link tables and just optimize the hell out of it with store procedure, which is what you mentioned now, that you're going to the next step with store procedure. So I tend to stick to it because there's two philosophies in this world with regards to Microsoft Access SQL Server. There are people who go to extreme and just don't use any bound fields on their forms, and it opens up and it's binding these links on and using temp table. It's just a mess because there's so much more code involved.
Yeah, all of my forms are bound. So
Yeah,
they're
that's
bound. So
perfect.
the temp tables are mirrored images of the live tables,
Yeah.
but with additional pre-computated fields, like so that I can put those in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't use unbound forms
Okay,
in my
good.
Access.
The other aspect of this is once it crashes, you have to manage those temp tables, reset them, and every time you start the application again, right? So it's just more code, more maintenance. But if it works for you, great. Then sometimes you have to do that, right? So I'm not saying you're not supposed to do that. Sometimes you do because of the fact the client has this expectation of speed that you need to do it.
Yeah, it was more for just even more so for speed. It was just so that they could manipulate the record without me having to save a master and then worry about saving the details. They could manipulate everything they wanted to for that record. And if they crash, they have to go back in. It reloads that one record it's a single record and then the details that go with it. So
okay, good. All right. So there is so much we can talk about views and optimization of views, but several things you need to be cognizant of. Number one is, like Donna's using views as her data source sometimes for forms, which is great, right? You can bind a view to a data source. Keep in mind that it's going to be read-only. If, however, you want to edit the data, which is nothing wrong with that, right? Sometimes I want to create an order form. I want to bind it to a view. And I want to be able to either edit that order, create new orders, and what have you. You have to add an index to that view, right? So if I come in here into Access and I look at these this view, right? I need to add an index. So if I come and put this in properties, design view, I'm gonna say yes to that. There's no index, right? Probably the index should be on invoice ID, right? So I come in here and I can I may want to go ahead and let's see if I can add the index right here. Indexes, right? I can add an index manually. The tool that Mark Edwards created last month automatically does it for you. If you notice, there's a column in there for index that you can use, and you can just type in this case. I would type in invoice ID. I can create an index when I create the link to the view. And you can, there's a blog post on my website, accessexperts.com/blog, accessexperts.com/start here. There's a table there, a blog post about how to create index using code as well. Once you create the index, then you get the data. But what happens is, if you have and this has only happened to me once or twice in my career. If you have a really complex view, 10, 12 tables, sometimes the SQL Server doesn't know where you want to insert the query, the data, right? I've seen this happen with a large amount of tables in a query. So I created my view. I created an index. I attached a view to a form. I added a new record and I get an error message. SQL Server does not know where you want to put this data. It happens, right? It's going to happen to you eventually one day. Same thing when I delete the data. It says, okay, where do you want to delete it from? I got 10 tables in this view. Where do you want to delete it from? All right. Now, what you do to avoid that, to fix that, is you create an insert trigger at SQL Server or a delete trigger. So I only mention it so if you ever come across this beyond the discussion of this introductory course. But in those cases, you would do an insert trigger, and delete trigger. And basically what that is code in SQL Server that you would write to say, whenever there's an insert on this view, don't do the regular view insert. Instead, do this, right? And so there's a copy of the data, and you create the table cursor and use, okay, then you can force it to save that record. It's a lot of code. which I always I always tell my employees, please don't do triggers unless you have to, but it is doable. Sometimes you have to do it. All right. Let's talk about stacking, right? Let's talk about stacking. And this is probably something we're going to be discussing next month. We call CTEs, count table expressions. But no, Access developers, we have a habit of stacking our queries, right? So I'll give you an example of this. I'm gonna come here to my queries. I mean, I do it too. I'm not immune from this. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by stacking my queries here. Give me a second. Let me see if I see it real quick. I'm just gonna put the step here. All right, see this? Step 1, step 2, right? Step 3. So I have these steps. I named these queries, right? So step 1 is the first query. Step 2 is based on step 1. Step 3 is based on step 2, right? It's like a chain of queries. This query, this case is these are action queries. But you know, you guys have, and I've done them with select queries. And you know, when I first started out with SQL Server, that's what I would do. I would create views, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3. You can do that. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do that. It does increase the amount of options in SQL Server. It does increase the complexity of your application because now there's multiple views you have to troubleshoot. And instead of doing that, if you want to read up on this before next month, you want to use common table expressions, CTEs, so that you have it all into one query, so in one view in SQL Server. It's a wonderful technique we'll be covering next month. All right. Sometimes the view doesn't cut it. It just doesn't. It's slow, performance issues, doesn't next finish off, right? So when you're having issues with a view, you need to troubleshoot. And here's my number 1 troubleshoot technique. I want to make sure that it runs on SQL Server first before I link it to Access, right? We need to make sure it's not an Access issue. So every time you create the view, make sure it executes, just like with your stored procedures, which we'll be talking later on in this course. You want to make sure it runs in the SQL Server before you link into Microsoft Access. Number 2, if it's slow in SQL Server, it's going to be much more slower in Access. That's just the reality of it. So running it on the console, right, then SQL Server Management Studio, if it's super slow there, it's going to be even slower in Access. So you want to address any performance issues in SQL Server Management Studio by adding additional indexes. Make sure the foreign keys has secondary index. Remember, SQL Server does not create foreign indexes automatically for you. We're as Access developers, we are how can I say this? Used to Access creating these secondary indexes for us, right? We create a table, order ID, order header, TBL order header, right? It's got order ID as the primary key. Then we create a new table called order details, and then that order details table, I have a order details ID, which is the primary key. Then I have order ID, which is a secondary key, which is a foreign key. Well, it will see the letters ID and your field automatically add that index. Remember, SQL Server does not do that. You have to add your own indexes in SQL Server. Now, to do that, you're going to come in here and you're going to go to your table. So I'm going to bring up a table here. And by the way, you can see what indexes are in the table by clicking here and looking at the indexes. You see all these. This one only has one index, so this is a great example. So let me see index companies, company docs. Okay, here, company docs. This is a good example. I got my indexes, right? I got the primary key, right? Let me expand this so you can see it better. I got the primary key, which is primary key doc ID, and then I do secondary indexes, right? Doc ID, company ID. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this in design view. Wonderful. Now I got this in design view. You can see the primary key defined here, right? And then I can go into table designer here and let's see here, indexes and keys. I noticed that there's a company ID here, and I noticed that there is this one's called ID docs ID company ID, and there's only one field here, company ID. But if I didn't, I would click on add here. And I would come in here into documents and I would click here and I would swap this out with company ID, right? Click on OK. Now, tip. If you want the secondary index to limit the data on here, right? There are certain situations where you want the secondary index to stop things, right? You business logic, right? That makes you can make sure you can set this to yes. What does that mean? When I set this to yes, what does that mean? It's unique. That basically there's only going to be one record per company in this table, right? Instead of having multiple docs per company, if I set this to yes, it's going to mean that I only have one document now per company, which doesn't make sense in my case, right? So I wouldn't do that. But if you do have a situation like that, where you only want to allow just one of a kind on an index, right? A certain combination of company and doc type ID, or say for example, my customer says, "I only there should only be one combination of this records. I can just use a secondary index to enforce that business logic," right? Great tip for you guys there. And then the other thing is we want to change the name on this. And so here name, I would say company ID because the secondary duplicate there, I would say company ID 2. And then once I send this, set it over here, right? So I'm gonna click on close. I'm not going to save this, but then I would click the save, and now I've created my secondary index. So you can use table design to enforce your business logic. What's another way of using table design? Well, you can, I had this particular case. By the way, I have a nightmare. I need to talk to you. I'm gonna wrap this up here in a few minutes, by the way, but I have a nightmare to talk to you about. It happened with my customers. But you could define a seed value to start, right? So if I come in here, document ID is my primary key. And if it's a auto increment, I can come down here and change it to automatically start a certain seed value. Identity specification, yes. So they're called identity, right? The SQL Server. And notice that I've got identity increment. I can increment the key by 10, by 10, by 20. I never reduce that. Or here, I can start and I can say, okay, I want the primary key to start at 100,000. And when you do that, the first record in the table will be 100,000, second one 100,001, and so forth. When will you do that? Well, sometimes when you're migrating this data over from Access, when you do this migration, for some reason you want to track which records were created once you migrate to SQL Server. So you could use the identity seed to start at a really large number beyond. So if the last company record, company docs ID in Access was 90,000, and I do the upgrade to SQL Server, I might start at 100,000. That way I know, oh, this record was created after we migrated to SQL Server. Right? So that's a good example. All right, so we talked a lot about views. I know through a lot of you guys, this is being recorded. The video of George Hepworth, who's on this call, God bless him. He's my video editor. He usually has this up in a few days. Next month is March. We'll be going back to our regular schedule, second Tuesday of the month. We're going to be talking more about views and start talking about CTEs. And let's get start talking about SQL Server sort procedures. And let's open it up with any questions before I tell you about my horror story. Any questions regarding views?
Can I just ask one quick question? Because that's all I've been doing.
Sure.
Sorry. I don't know if people out there are using a lot of Azure SQL Server, but what I've been noticing is that if I don't use my app, my Access application for a bit, I start to get TCP and timeout errors.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what happens is it goes to sleep. I mean, that's a non-technical term, but I've noticed that too, that an Azure database will go into some sort of inactive mode, and it takes a couple of prods from a query to wake it up and get it running again.
Well, it doesn't show like, # deleted or anything like that. It just says TCP provider, an existing connection was forcibly closed by the remote host. And I say, okay, and I can actually go and view the data, but I keep getting that over and over. And the only way out of it is to close and reopen.
Well, that's a different issue. Yeah.
What driver are you using in your application for?
The latest? Well, I'm using DNS-less connections, and then I'm using the latest drivers, whatever they are.
ODBC 18 and
Yeah.
ODBC 19. All right.
Yeah, yeah.
You want to make sure that there is no setting in your Azure service. Are you using SQL Server Azure service?
Yes.
Yeah, make sure that there's no setting in there that's going to disconnect you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greg was wondering the same thing in Cambodia as I was. What driver you're using? That's not the default. That's not a good behavior. I designed these applications. People use them throughout the day. My clients would be pissed if they were using the application and then it times out on them, right? It's just not good behavior. So make sure there's no setting in there that's stopping you from doing that.
Oh, okay. Here's another possibility, and this is reaching, but I have seen where I get a network interruption, and it will lose that connection briefly.
Yeah, that's what usually it is, by the way. Your ISP provider might have hiccups and lose it. But, the ODBC driver, Microsoft Access is much better these days in avoiding those drops. So
Yeah,
I want to say that that shouldn't happen because by its nature, it's a disconnected connection anyway, right? There's no constant flowing back and forth between Access and SQL Server every milliseconds. It's just, there's just bursts of data coming back and forth. And Access opens multiple connections to SQL Server. There's no way to control that except in your code, but you can control it through one connection using easy ADB.
Yeah, and I do that, and I am using between ODBC and ADODB, I have one for each that I kind of renew. If the connection's open, I keep it, I use it, right?
Good.
I just didn't know if anyone knew of any settings like under, file options or anything like that for Access to look at.
All right. Well, look, there might be a timeout, right? That you can adjust. There is a timeout you can adjust in your Access application.
Mhm.
You can increase that timeout, but I would search that in there. And for the life of me, I don't know what it is. I only have to play it once or twice, but once, twice. But sometimes, it times out, and you can increase that so the Access is more tolerant. It doesn't disconnect you. Greg wants to know what's the difference between native client 13 and 19. Really, Greg, the difference between versions and a native client is that the higher level the client, the more features it supports, especially the higher in Azure, right? So you have Azure service that does a lot of things that a regular SQL Server Express doesn't do. And if you want to leverage all those features, such as multi-factor authentication, with your Microsoft Access applications, you have to use a higher level driver. Always use the latest driver. That's what I always recommend. Any other questions?
Just one comment, Juan. Under Access options, client settings, there's a place to increase the refresh interval and the number of update retries.
Yeah, I
All right,
tried playing around with those.
That didn't.
Okay.
That didn't
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. Just and then just one more thing. In terms of SQL Azure, with the do you guys do single sign-on? Like if you have like an Office 365 tenant, was there anything special you had to do with your SQL Server and your SQL Azure in order to enable the sign-on to utilize your M365 login?
Well, single sign-on. So for those who don't know what that is you sign in once, and then all these services work for you, right? And so I don't know of a way to do that SS single sign-on with Microsoft Access, but we do use MFA, multi-factor authentication with Azure, so that and Office 365. So when you log in, it does it. Would you like to see an example of that?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna come in here, close this up. No, say no to that. I restarted my demo app. And this is not code that's in the wild. This is something we figured out at Temp, but this is a proprietary technique, but it does work. Let me see if I can get this. I've been playing with this demo now, so I'm wondering if it'll stop working. It looks like there you go. All right. So notice that there is no password field, right? So I put in my account, right? My Office 365 account. And now it launches this familiar dialog, right, which is my password. But this is coming from Azure. It's not coming from Access, right? This is a Microsoft prompt, like a web page for Microsoft. And now I can do this to authenticate myself, which is MFA. So now I go in my cell phone and I approve it. It shows up on my Microsoft Authenticator app, which I'm going to show up here on the screen here. Microsoft Authenticator app. And now I click on that and bam, I'm into the system. So that MFA capability, that took us a long time to figure out. It's not common knowledge. It's something that we're not going to share yet with anybody else, but we use that as a competitive advantage with our other competition out there. Very few people need MFA and Access. Usually is a corporate level. And so we use that here, but it can be done, right, with Microsoft Access. All right, any other questions before we go to my nightmare? All right. Well, look, I had a client who called me up on Saturday. I'm in Mexico in Cancun, right? Recovering from my operation on Saturday night in Mexico. And he calls me up and says, Juan, my server is kaput. It would die on me. Do you have a backup of our database? I'm like, no, because I'm the software guy, right? It's not my responsibility to back up your database. That's something done by your IT. But it so happens that he is switched. He had an IT guy on his staff, which was not as good as he liked, and he fired him, hired an MSP. And this is a company that's supposed to back up your servers. Well, the MSP had taken over the operation for several weeks now, and they never verified that there was a backup in the server. So he lost data. And the last backup we got, and over the weekend, oh my gosh, back and forth, all the way up to my Super Bowl party, because we resort through an amazing Super Bowl party. And George, you can see that on my Facebook page for us. George is a friend of mine on Facebook. And I said, look, once the party starts, I'm not going to be able to help you out here. But it turns out that here we are in February. The last backup they found was in November 20th of last year. And so several things to know from this. Number one is when you work on this, I have a habit of creating backups of my backups, right? In other words, if I work on this project for 4 hours straight, at the 4-hour mark, I create a backup. And then when I'm done at the end of the day, I create a backup. I mean, I'm just maniacal about creating backups because I know, and George knows this too, and many of you do know this, that this can get corrupted, right? The database gets corrupted and you don't know what you lost it. So if you're not backing up throughout the day, one day you're going to get bit by the issue where the file gets corrupted and you lost a whole day's of work. In my case, I will only lose half a day of work because I back it up every 2 hours a day. So that's number one. Number two is it's not enough that you have backups. You have to actually verify that you can restore. So I always encourage my clients to do a simulation, right? Let's do a simulation where we lost the server. Let's spin up another server. I mean, how long does it take to recover, right? These are mission critical applications. In this case, this customer has 100 employees. And come Monday morning, they weren't able to work. They just now today, Wednesday, are up and running. And it wasn't because of me, because they didn't get everything in place until now Wednesday. So if there is a backup, you make sure that backup works. I'll give you a classic example of this. In the old days, remember those cassettes that people would use to back up their data? All right, they look like regular audio tapes. Well, it turns out there was a secretary that her responsibility is to insert a cassette when she went home from work, right? So she had 5 cassettes, and she was there Monday through Friday, and her job was at the end of the day, they told her, make sure you insert the cassette. So she would, today, Wednesday, she would take out the Tuesday tape, put that away in the safe, and put in Wednesday's tape. Well, they lost the server, and they went to the backups. There was nothing there. Turns out that, they went to the secretary and says, well, there's nothing in this tape. He says, well, that's all they told me to do is to take out the tape and put it in, right? And so nobody told her how to check that the backup occurred. Nobody bothered to check that backups were occurring. All of us, she's doing that mechanical, putting tapes in and out, right? So make sure you check that their backups are occurring, that your clients check that. And it was your responsibility. At some point, I was an IT manager for a company here in Chicago. It was my responsibility. I was maniacal about that. So what this customer had to do is they had to take the server, drive overnight on Monday to arrive to a Sunday night. He drove overnight to Cleveland from Chicago, so that Monday morning he can walk into a clean room lab in Cleveland that will extract this data from their hard drive RAID configuration. So he can back up. He can give me another one. All right. Donna says, how long before communication link failure? All right. Look, this is it for me. Thank you so much. I can't say how much I appreciate you guys being here. We had a great group turnout today. Donna, thank you so much for your questions. Greg, George, Mark, everybody who participated, thank you so much. Come back here next month. We're going to talk more about CTEs and get started in touching on SOAR procedures. So long, everybody. Good night.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juan.
You bet. Thank you.